All right. Well, hi, everybody. Yeah, super excited to be here. Zachary Gaba. I work at Disney. If you've heard me talk before previously, it was at Hulu, and that is the same company still, thanks to mergers and acquisitions, the kind of theme of the last few years. Whereas previously focused on Hulu, the video streaming stack there, Disney focused across all of the direct-to-consumer applications, including Hulu, Disney+, ESPN, and a plethora of other services. Being the first kind of talk set that we're doing in person after the pandemic, I thought we'd just repeat the same topic we did before the pandemic, because there's nothing like time not moving. But in all kidding aside, I've gotten a lot of questions more recently, especially as companies have focused more on a move to profitability, move to efficiency, move to scale, around making ad insertion better and actually profiting off of it. And from a technology and standardization perspective, server-guided ad insertion has been kind of the momentum we've been driving within the overall ecosystem to drive that forward. So I want to give a kind of overview of what that is, kind of the state of the industry as it is today, and then we can talk a little bit about what we need to do next to keep this going. Sorry, there we go. So agenda, I want to define server-guided ad insertion. I've heard like 18 different definitions in the last 4 months, so I think the more we can align on it, the better. Talk about state of the industry and next steps, like I said. So let's get right in there. Defining server-guided ad insertion, right? And to do that, there's one thing I really want to align on, and it's not to offend or anything, just terminology alignment, so that we are all talking about the same thing in this current presentation. First one is a player. The context here, I'm talking about a player as a software component that an application provides a streaming URL to. So the MPD, the M308, the MP4, right? If you want to go to a real spec parlance, it's a type 1 player. It does everything under the hood with ABR and resolutions and downloads. A type 3 player would be something more like MSE, EME. But for what we're talking about here is just the thing you give the URL and then you want it to make video go, right? And then the other side of that is the application, and that's the software stack that utilizes the video component to play video and audio experiences, right? It doesn't have to just be video, it doesn't have to just be audio, it can be a combination of the two. And I draw this distinction because this is where the distinction of server-guided ad insertion comes in from the previous eras of what we've had in the industry. So if we look a little bit at the evolution of ad insertion, the dawn of time, and I didn't have enough time to get like real cheeky with animations or whatever, so basically get a lot of text, and I apologize. Anyhow, we really started out with client-side ad insertion. This was even before we had the idea of ABR streaming. We did have the idea that, hey, we want to put ads on that thing, so that's good. That's been a strong part of our world. But it was really, really basic. So in order to do client-side, you really had the media as separate things. So you had your main content as one file, and your ads or all auxiliary content as another. So they were separate streams, right? When you wanted to interleave these to make an experience, it was the application doing this heavy work, right? So the application would be monitoring progress. It hit stop. It'd either unload the player or load a second player to load the advertisement content or auxiliary content they want to play and play that out and then wait for that to end. It was not the greatest experience. Today we complained about 100 millisecond timing coming out of the video tag. That used to be a great luxury. 1500 milliseconds was kind of the main bar, and sometimes around 2 to 3 seconds, just because of the overall load and the quality of the devices back in 2010, 2011. And that meant if you really wanted to do seamless playout, you actually had to have dual players. That was really complicated. Surprisingly, you could do it a lot more in the past, and maybe that's just the economics of scale. You actually spend less on the hardware as you continue to make more profit off of it. But you had to run two players separately within the application space to do that playout. But from a scale perspective, this is actually really good, right? Because your main content, you're playing it out, you want ads, you go call the ad server, it's all separate, right? The client is distributing the scale out, and that's really, really beneficial, and that's great. And then we were like, well, we want the experience to be better, right? Like this is actually what drove me into media. I started in Hulu as part of the living room application development, and just could not stand the advertising experience. It was so bad across devices. I wanted to get wanted to get that further out. And a lot of what the industry embraced was server-side ad insertion, right? And it was trying to view this from a different way. How can we make a seamless experience? And just to like preempt a couple of things here, there was a conversation about ad blockers. There's no solve for those. It's a cat and mouse game. I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but just noting that. But server-side insertion really wanted to make a better experience for the user. And so when you think about the media presentation, you were actually stitching the media together to create a single file. And because we were doing this in the Dash HLS smooth streaming at the time world, you were doing everything as a single initialization to that player. And so it was up to the service to actually coordinate the combination of these things, right? So the service would figure out your main content, figure out what you want to do from injection of pieces, and then send that fun, extremely long URL down to the client, which you'd push into the player, and the player would go, right? But that meant you could do seamless playout with a single player. And that's really valuable because you had a much better QoE. And the users were happy, right? Like we used to have a mantra that like the only annoying ad is one that buffers, right? The less interruptive that it is, even if it is an advertisement, it can be better. And this doesn't apply to just advertisements. It's a common example, but things like network bumpers, slates, rating cards, these are all interstitial pieces of content. But then you have the downside, which is that you've centralized your scale, right? You had one service that had to scale horizontally to affect all these users, and if the more you were trying to focus on user-based personalization, the harder it was to take that horizontal scale. Unless you just kind of threw dump trucks full of money at it, and then we get to 2020 and the cost push across the industry of like, okay, we need to do this, but we can't spend mountains of money on it. What we really started looking at in Hulu at the time, this is more like 2018, was we were going into live, right? The Hulu Live TV product had launched, and we wanted to take advantage of the ad service. We wanted to have the idea of I can sell an ad, VOD or live, doesn't matter, but it's one-to-one ad insertion, so I don't have to care what the stream is. Well, if I don't have to care what the stream is, then I need to separate the concept of what the mainstream is from what that auxiliary content is. But I still want seamless playout. I still want the QoE. I still want to have this on a plethora of devices rather than the set that can support 2 players, right? And so we went a different approach, and we proposed this idea at Focus 2019 of server-guided ad insertion. Focused on live, but then expanded to VOD. And the idea is that the media presentations are still separate, right? You've got your main content over here, ads over here. But the key differentiator is that the main content is conditioned and then more or less pointing to, right? It has an understanding and indication within it of where opportunities are. So it's well-formed and positioned to have resolution. The thing doing the experience coordination, though, is the player, right? Like you don't need to go to the app and have it do the resolution, come back down. Sure, you can do inflation of parameters or whatnot still, but you want the player to coordinate this because you want to be able to do a lot of optimization. Explicitly, you want to be able to virtualize your buffer and play seamlessly through these different assets. And that meant the seamless requirement could be a single player. That's a really powerful concept, right? And then you actually had the other benefit of this. You were pushing the scale back down to the clients. You were distributing it out because the clients were doing the ad calls or interstitial calls as needed, right? You wouldn't actually have to resolve it all at the start access point. The access of your stream is making a concerted effort to understand, what content you're trying to access, do you have the rights, what features and functionality you want to enable, and after that, you're going to go to somewhere else to get that interstitial content. And that's the real differentiator, right? Like you're enabling the scale points, you're enabling the seamless playout, but you're doing it in player. And so that's a lot of words, a lot of description. But if you had to take away anything, I would actually say simplify it. You can think about these 3 types of insertion based on who's doing the coordination, because it speaks a lot to where the complexity of this implementation is. Client-side ad insertion was the application managing the experience. You want to take the experience, the playback experience. Server-side ad insertion was the server managing this, right? The client was more or less just going through the motions of doing playout. And then server-guided is trying to push you back to the player being the manager of that experience. And as we look more towards interactive experiences and immersive experiences, having the player be that central experience coordination piece, it's actually going to be a pretty powerful thought. So that's server-guided ad insertion. That's how I would propose the overall definition. And if you've read any specs that I've had a hand in, that's how it's in there. So that's what it is. So if you look at the state of the industry, like how do you go and adopt this, right? The first, when we presented this out originally, it was all very custom, and that's very easy to do when you're very vertical, right? You control every part of the stack, you can do kind of whatever you want. And if you really want this to work, there's kind of like 4 foundational pieces that you have to have. The first is content conditioning, right? And like I really, really can't state this enough. The more times I've seen services try to do ad insertion without conditioning content is just, it's sad. It makes me sad. It makes me sad for anybody that uses it. And I know the people that are serving it are also sad. Opportunity signaling, right? Okay, so you've conditioned the content. You need to be able to carry through the signals of, hey, this is where you can actually do insertions that's separate from the actual processing of it. Yeah. Kind of skated by with the server-side insertion. Everything about the session was actually being signaled through baked-in URL query params and paths. And that, in order for that to separate the scale and be cacheable, you actually have to pull that out of the main content and externalize it. And the last part is you actually have to have players adopt these features, right? So I want to walk through a couple of these and make sure I don't go over time. I want to walk through these and talk through where we are within the industry, right? So first thing, content conditioning. There's three kind of well-known definitions when it comes to content conditioning. So here I'm going to play three types of streams as if they're going through an encoder out. The yellow lines, think of them as a add out, add in, or sorry, break out, break in point in time, right, where I want to start the ad and end the ad. So the first well-known type is actually create fragments, CMF fragments at these opportunity boundaries, right? So you're doing it in code, you make a SAP12, and you put a fragment boundary. That's the best case scenario for any player in the world because they can just stop buffering the main content at the end of it. This does mean your segments and fragments do not have consistent durations. They do not have consistent sizing. And there can be tolerance issues if you have something like 500 millisecond segments. There's certain players that don't like that. But all these things are kind of workable. The next level is to do the SAP12 creation, but don't actually do a fragmentation. So it's basically force an IDR in there, but keep the segment durations very consistent. Well, this is done. This is typically done more on ingest rather than actual playout. And then the third one is just, somebody will figure it out besides me. Here's a stream. We're not encoding it. It's just going to be packaged out. A number of different specs. So the Dash IOP part 5 on advertising walks through these three. It's highly recommended to do one. Do the fragmenting at the opportunity boundary because it's going to be the most interoperable. Live media ingest does 1 or 2 because it's more about the ingest and not about the playout. And then in the Dash HLS interop spec, it's actually restricted to that first formatting type, right? But I'd rather show you all of them rather than lie to you that there's no other option. But please do that. And the other interesting thing to call out here is like as you're fragmenting, right? You're doing this on video, audio, and text all at the same time, potentially also some time-aligned data as well. Spoilers, like things don't actually align across video, audio all the time. But it is possible to do this within a tolerance of, here's a fun spec term, an ISO BMFS sample duration. And that is just a fancy way of saying one frame with whatever media type you're in. So if you're fragmenting on video, try to fragment the audio within one frame of the audio sample. Very doable. It takes a little bit of time and concerted effort to get it set up. But that's kind of the standardization bits on that. So then you move down to opportunity signaling. You've conditioned your content. It's ready to go. It's cool. It's all good. Opportunity signaling. Well, in order to signal opportunity, it has to be within the signaling format you're using. We're using kind of 2 in the industry, Dash and HLS. And we have actually seen great movement across, right? So there's an internal versus external date. I think 2021, HLS interstitials came out from Apple. And the idea is being able to specify a class, data range tag class that signals to the player, hey, at this point, I want you to go out to this alternate URL and do a resolution. There's a little bit more parameters. Apple devices typically have some of the nicest hardware that you're going to work with, so they are a lot more powerful. They do not need content fragmented at boundaries and the like, but there are parameters and whatnot. XSnap example, which tells it to force it to a fragment boundary rather than trying to do it at an exact time. Little semantics here and there. But yeah, so like HLS interstitials, it's great to see. And this works in VOD and live, right? So in VOD, you're doing an insert at a time. If you have dirty VOD, if any cable providers here, with burned-in ads, you can actually do it on that as well. And then live, it works as well with the ability to do a early cutback or late return as well. So very, very useful. On the flip side, on the Dash side, there's been two kind of proposals. The first was to utilize xlink on request, which could be applied in both the VOD live case. And the idea there is you have either placeholder periods in the VOD sense where you're trying to insert, or you have periods with quote unquote default content in live, which is just you have your live period decorated with xlink that gets replaced. And it's kind of similar to HLS is, hey, go get another document that has my ads and come in and insert it here. Now I'm glossing over a lot of detail about the Dash spec here, but there's concerns about how this affects in the semantic equivalence of xlink. And so there's actually a new format being proposed, and actually within the 6th edition of the Dash spec, which is called the media presentation insert. And it is much more like the HLS interstitial spec. You have an event stream. It says at this time, the event stream tells you what to do. So in this case, value insert, because I'm in a VOD, insert at this point in time, whatever you get from this secondary URL. Now this gets you to more of a HLS interstitials-like semantic, but does have kind of the takeaway of you're now splitting the timing model within the Dash client. So this is like hot off the press. I think it was put in the final spec text a couple of months ago. And so we are still working through the interoperability story to that. But very cool to see, very exciting, right? We actually have a pathway to both specs having good support for this in both VOD and live. Yeah, that's opportunity signaling. I'll leave time at the end for questions. I see concerned faces. But the other thing I said that we need to do is externalize the session identifier. And this is something that also worked with Apple to get into the spec. But HLS XX define was a common way to do token injection within the multivariant and the variant, but you couldn't actually take from outside. We simply asked, can we reference a query parameter, right? Because then you can attach arbitrary parameters to a URL, but the URL, like when you're doing a generation, can ignore those parameters and then have the semantics of, hey, go pull this forward. So to give you an example of this, and very also important to call out, it's in version 11 of HLS, if you're not on that one. But you say XX define, I'm going to define a token called session token, and I want it to be filled from the query parameter called token, right? And then for the rest of that in 308, you can actually use session token as a named variable and inject it into other URLs. And so here, back in that HLS interstitial tag, I'm injecting it as the token query parameter of the call through onto the interstitial, right? Very powerful. This means that you have nothing interesting about the user within this M308, and it's all cacheable and shared across, right? Dash actually had existing mechanism for this, XURL query info. These things are really hard to say just at the top of your tongue. But kind of a similar syntax of for the request in Dash, because you're doing it as a centralized object, you tell it which request to include it on, whereas in HLS, you're explicitly putting it in the URLs that you want it to do. And then you're defining a query template. That query template is evaluated, and you can say, hey, pull it from the MPD URL as well. So it gives you this nice little chain effect. And I kind of glossed over it, but for M308s, you could put it on the MV, and then the MV could pass through to the actual variant as well, right? You just kind of chain. Super fun. But it means we actually have gotten to the point where sufficiently advanced stack implementations can do this at scale with standard compliant implementations, which is great. Which gets us to the last and super fun topic, player feature adoption, right? It's cool to have all these things specified and updated, but right now, there's really only implementation in closed source and internal only players, right? HLS interstitials supported great, AV Foundation. Not really anywhere else, right? And similarly, like the Dash mechanics, xlink is here and there. I think actually the Roku player is the furthest along of the open players that or not open, but available to general public. So yeah, that's an unfortunate thing. So instead of telling you about the successes here, I thought I'd highlight 4 pitfalls for anybody watching this or in the room that is a player developer, here's 4 pitfalls in implementing this that you should just watch out for. So, common pitfalls. The first thing is not virtualizing your playout buffer. What I see a lot of people try to do for this implementation is spin up another player, just internal, right? Like, oh, my API is now just a secondary API internally, and I'm spinning up 2 video segments. No, don't do that, right? I know in the HLS interstitial spec, it's like, oh, we're just spinning up another player. Again, has the hardware to do that? Cool. Don't do it. Everything about a server-side stitch stream that brings the complexities of putting that into a buffer, you can if you virtualize out, you merge the semantics of SSAI and SGAI. So it's really just a timeliness of resolution. It does mean it's more complex. You have to manage PTS clocks. And that can be hard on smart TVs, but I can tell you it can be done. Yeah, so that was the first one. The other one is when you're exposing things back out to the application, expose the experience timeline. Don't expose anything raw off the buffer coming out of the media engine. Because a lot of times you see clocks tied timing-wise or other machinations to whatever's physically within the media source buffer. It's a weird paradigm, especially when you start talking about fluctuating blocks of available content within the stream. So expose an experience, right? Oh, this content is this, or it's a live stream, and we got to figure out the right definition of that, but exposing an experience is far, far better. It's going to give you a better level of extraction. The other thing I would say is measure codec switches. I know everybody wants to have all the same codecs all the time. You're not going to have it in all the cases. But the important thing is to measure and instrument the codec switching, because that is where the 90% of the bugs are going to come in as you're moving across. So like, oh, well, this time the video codec transitioned before the audio codec, and that meant the audio clock didn't synchronize, right? Like, heavily instrument those transitions. And then the final one, which might seem a little odd, start from encrypted pipelines if you are playing encrypted content. It is way, way easier to take unencrypted content and shove it through encrypted pipelines than it is to destroy and recreate the encrypted pipelines, because you have to go through entire session recreations. And it's virtually supported everywhere. Just don't go sub 2015 smart TVs. But yeah, so common pitfalls. And I think this is really where we need to encourage help or adoption or support for open source development communities. So yeah, next steps. And not too bad on timing there. So real next steps, like finish the standardization interoperability. Like I said, Dash just put this mechanic in. We need to finalize it. We need to check all the edge cases, finalize it, and then also settle the debate between xlink and this methodology, or find a way to do both. I don't particularly care whatever the cup of tea is. We just need to figure it out. And from there, Dash.IF can provide VOD and live guidance and actually have a strong companion. And then from that, we can define interoperability between Dash and HLS, because nobody's serving really one format. The more that we validate, constrain, and provide the mapping, great. It helps move everything together. It makes the player development easier, because you don't have to think about a bunch of different use cases. And the final bit is the SVTA advertising worker group, which is a random throw, no? Well, the other part of doing this stitching is that there's a whole bunch of exterior metadata that occurs when you do an ad call, like beaconing or verification vendors or whatnot. And even just simple things like signaling, hey, ad starts here, ad ends here, ad slot starts, This signaling mechanic is kind of in the wind all over the place. And one of the things that the advertising working group is trying to normalize is the idea of how this metadata is carried within both specs. So you can commonly signal and have all the fun experiences. And and then the last thing I would say is like share case studies, right? Like the more we share, the more we can all learn, the more we can see different approaches and different use cases, right? Like one of my favorite talks ever was the presentation about the in-flight entertainment and like the weird test case of like, well, if somebody's head hits this at 100 miles an hour, does it still function? Like that is a weird test case, but sure, I get it. But yeah, so like in this particular case, I did the DMUX talk in 2019. Disney Plus its ad support is fully SGAI in the VOD space, and that's been very beneficial there. Blog post written about that, and I was really excited to see Pluto TV's embracement of this paradigm at DMUX this year with server-initiated client-side just-in-time stitching in APR streaming talk. which was really good, and I really appreciate them sharing that expertise. But yeah, so that's all I have. But a primer on what it is and all that. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Zach. That was great. Who has questions? I have a question while other people are thinking.
Sure.
The tips or pitfalls for player developers. You mentioned the codec switching. Would that also apply to things like, the same codec but different profiles, different bit rates, and so on?
Oh yes, yeah. My favorite is EC3 2-channel and 6-channel. That works awfully.
Dolby says it works great.
I can't speak for Dolby. Yeah.
Any questions from the room?
So
Let me give you the mic.
Oh wow. So you guys have this deployed like at scale already, it sounds like, right? So you're talking about closed source players, but you've done this at scale. How does it change your, like you still have to scale your ad servers or wherever these,
Right.
interstitials are requested from? Like, has it significantly changed your cost of operating, significantly reduced your cost of operating ad supported, especially live streams?
It's a really good question. I think somebody in comms would hit me for talking too much about that. But generally, yes, it helps a lot. It not only increases the ability to provide that separation of concerns when, in particular, set of scale, right? Like ads scales as much as they want to scale. If they don't want to do one-to-one for that stream, they don't have to scale to that. But the content systems only have to run at the scale of the content. And so, like Hulu Live right now has, I think, 1,600, 1,700 channels constantly, 24/7 channels, and it's like 2,000 RPS or something like that, just because it's highly, highly cached. We also have a bunch of other optimization on top of that, like MPD patch, all that stuff. But it is beneficial, and then on top of that, you can start bleeding experiences by changing how you're splicing together into different in application contexts, right? Like the same content can go in different app instances.
Let me go to you first.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that has come up I think over the last couple of years in MPEG is the idea of signaling a switching point in advance. I don't think that's currently part of the standard protocols, and it could introduce other problems. Of course, if you signal that something is going to happen in the future and then it turns out not to happen, that could be a problem too. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether having a warning somewhere in the stream is a valuable idea.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, it's an area I've seen a lot of people explore, especially when you think about live broadcasters. I've seen 3 or 4 separate SCSI-35 implementations of a pre-warned signal. They all have the same considerations of, oh, I'm going to go to a break. Never mind. That type of like mechanics that you're operating on, because that affects not only what you're doing at encode, but also package. And then if you are doing calls out to the ad server, the timeliness of those beacons. So there's a lot around. If we built one mechanic and built it well, we could coordinate a bit better in the industry on it. So that'd be interesting. I also think this was actually raised to me today by somebody else. Europe or UK and France have a similar 35 secondary like signaling methodology, so they can do the same thing. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of content conditioning, and I'm just curious, did you learn that lesson the hard way and then have to go back and start to precondition the content, or did you know before you started doing ad insertion that this is something that needs to be done?
We learned that the long way around, right? Like Hulu, as it originally evolved, it was flash video streaming, it was MP4 streaming, it was everything, right? And as it was doing, we were going from the dual player to the stitched SSAI. We were realizing like how many problems this caused, and it's just like we can't forward seek through this GOP to try and make this work. And so, just from day one, it was just day one on Stitch. It was like, nope. Throw the IDI in there. Let's make this simple, and yeah, it's worked well.